Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleworks online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit organization. We are currently in our Winter 2 session, and it's not too late to register. We offer a variety of fine art drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We also offer classes in digital painting and illustration. Details can be found on our website, the Atelier at flowerfield.org. Our next exhibition is a middle and high school student artist juried show, which runs from March 10th to April 10th. Tonight's lecture is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management. The lecture is titled A Triumphant Triad, a comparison and contrast of 3 Gilded Age artists, Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn, and is being given by artist and professor emeritus Neill Slaughter, who taught fine art courses and art history at the university level for 4 decades, in addition to exhibiting his drawings and paintings nationally and internationally. We welcome him this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room, and we will answer them at the end of the lecture. I shall now hand over to Neill Slaughter.
Can everybody hear me? I hope. I just want to say I owe a debt of thanks to Gabby and Brianna and Joan Rockwell and the whole Atelier at Flowerfield for inviting me for this lecture. It's a wonderful opportunity, and it's also extremely gratifying that on this evening, given that there's all this competition out there with TV from Netflix to the Olympics, that we have a large audience that signed up, over 150 people, I was told. So I'm very grateful for that. And ironically, there's an exhibition reception in New York City tonight for a show that I'm actually one of the exhibiting artists, but I'd much rather sit here in my home and share with the audience tonight some of what I have learned about Singer Sargent, Joaquín Sorolla, and Anders Zorn over the last 4 decades or so. So without further ado, I think I'm going to just jump right in here. Here are 3 self-portraits by them, and Singer Sargent, Joaquín Sorolla, and Anders Zorn became internationally renowned during their lifetime, primarily as portrait painters, thereby preserving for posterity a wide array of individuals. In addition to painting themselves, as you see here, they painted a wide array of other individuals, including their family and friends, fellow artists, actors, writers, poets, musicians, composers, philanthropists, politicians, bankers, industrialists, the aristocracy of Great Britain and Europe, and many other lords and ladies, and even kings and queens. And all 3 of these artists painted US presidents. In short, they painted everyone that was anyone. This is a picture that you see here by Sargent that hangs in the Fogg Museum in Harvard. It's one of my favorite little paintings, and it's Sargent's sister, younger sister, Violet, who incidentally is the grandmother of Richard Orman, the foremost authority on Sargent in the world, and he's written numerous volumes, including the catalog raisonné on Sargent. And this painting, I just think, is really charming, and because it's of his sister. Now, let me just show you these 2 pictures. I thought it was kind of interesting that in my research, I found pictures of both Zorn's wife and Sorolla's wife, and they're both reading the newspapers. Incidentally, that painting on the left of Zorn of 1887, that painting was completed at a time when he was transitioning from watercolor to oil paints, and that was in St. Ives, England. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. They painted fellow artists, as I mentioned, and here's Dennis Bunker. He was a friend of Sargent's, and this is not wholly unlike a painting I'm going to show you a little later on of Sargent painting Monet painting a painting. And on the right, we have Wilford and Jane de Glen. They were great friends of Sargent, and they accompanied him on numerous painting holidays throughout Europe. And this was a time when Sargent could relieve the stress from all of his portrait commissions from the 1890s through the first decade of the 20th century. That paint, let me just say this. This painting on the right is one of my favorites, and it's in the Chicago Art Institute. And then they painted actors. Here's a Zorn's painting of Cadet. He was a famous Comédie Française actor, whom, by the way, Saroya also painted. And on the right, we have Sargent's painting of Edwin Booth. He was a famous Shakespearean actor, and his home in Gramercy Park is now the Players Club in New York City. Unfortunately, he happened to be the brother of John Wilkes Booth. I find it rather apropos that Sargent should paint Booth in front of his fireplace with only a few glowing embers, perhaps symbolic of his theatrical career having waned, or shall we say burned out, after the assassination of Lincoln, even though Edwin Booth strongly supported Lincoln. Here are a couple of writers. One's a poet, that's Sargent's Coventry Patmore on the left. Sargent liked him so much that he also used him as one of his prophets in his Boston Library murals. And on the right, we have Blasco Ibáñez. He was a social commentary writer who heavily influenced Sorolla, and Sorolla did a whole slew of social commentary paintings, which I will cover a little bit later. Composers and musicians, we have Gabriel Fauré on the left, and on the right, we have the concert master and lead violinist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Charles Loeffler. And of course, we have to mention philanthropists. Probably the principal philanthropist of the day, who was exceedingly generous with both Zorn and Sargent. She commissioned a number of paintings from them and likewise bought their paintings. If you've never been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, you owe yourself an opportunity to go there, because it's like walking into a Venetian palace. You cannot believe the sumptuousness of it. And famous old master paintings are there, in addition to, well, in her day, contemporary artists such as Zorn and Sargent. That painting, in fact, on the right is a little watercolor study that Sargent did of Isabella Stewart Gardner in her elderly years, and it was just a gift to her after having completed a formal portrait of her. They painted politicians. Here's Sargent's painting, looking very elegant, the Prime Minister of England, Arthur Balfour at that time. I should mention here that you can perhaps say, gosh, was that guy really that tall and that elegant? Sargent had a real knack for making people look better than they actually did. I've seen photographs of both that guy I showed you earlier, Coventry Patmore, the poet, and black and white photographs of the Prime Minister of England and other people that Sargent painted. And he would capture the likeness, but somehow he would just make them that much more monumental than perhaps they were. Now, having said that, Nancy Astor was indeed a great beauty, one of the loveliest ladies in all of England. And she happened to be rather ambitious. She became the first lady woman of Parliament. She used to hold these great parties at her home, this fabulous house, great manor house outside of London, where she would hold these lavish dinner parties to hash out deals with her fellow politicians, including Winston Churchill. And have a cute story. Once upon a time, when she was having one of these lavish dinner parties, Winston Churchill, who liked to knock back, copious amounts of champagne, probably had a little bit too much and had made some off-color remark. And Lady Astor looked at him, and in a sort of a serious and slightly joking way, she said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I'd poison your drink." And without skipping a beat, Winston raises his glass of champagne. He says, "Lady Astor, if you were my wife, I'd gladly drink it." And then today, Cliveden is a very plush hotel, although that painting still hangs right in I guess, the lobby area of the hotel now. But this is where Princess Meghan Markle and Prince Harry stayed the day of their wedding. They also painted industrialists. Here are two paintings by Zorn, one of Andrew Carnegie and the other one of Henry Clay Pierce. Pierce proved to be very problematic in that he demanded 21 changes to be made by Zorn of not only his portrait, but that of his wife and his daughter. Zorn looked at him and said, well, they're fine. They look like you, and I'm not going to make any changes. I don't see any need to. And of course, Pierce wasn't paying him. So Zorn had to actually take him to court. He had to sue him. And it went back and forth in the court for a while. And eventually Zorn won. And not only did he gain the original fee, he also acquired all the back interest that was due to him from those months. And on the right, of course, we have the richest man in the world. He proved not to be a problem at all. The aristocracy of Great Britain and Europe. All these three artists painted the aristocracy. These are a couple of Sargent paintings. On the left, we have Sir Frank Swettenham. I know, have heard the term, the sun has never set on the English Empire or the British Empire, and that's because of colonists like Sir Frank Swettenham who helped colonize Singapore. And on the right, we have the Duke of Marlborough and his American wife. It's like the Downton Abbey story. That's Consuelo Vanderbilt. She brought the big fortune to this guy who was rich in land and had an amazing palace built by his forebears. But towards the end of the 19th century, he needed some propping up. And of course, he marries money. She eventually divorced him, though, but not before Sargent did this grand portrait. It's actually Sargent's largest family portrait. I should mention here that Blenheim Palace is, if you haven't been to England, it's sort of the equivalent of Versailles in Paris or outside of Paris. And Winston Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace in November of 1874 because his wife, who was another American beauty, Jenny Jerome, had married Lord Randolph Churchill, who was the younger brother of the Duke. And they were visiting him or the family, and one weekend when she went into labor, Jenny Jerome, that is, and so Winston actually got to be born in the palace, even though he nor his father could ever become the Duke unless the Duke had died. And in fact, Winston's father died prematurely young, actually. Here's the King and Queen of Spain, painted by Saroya. I've seen a black and white photograph of Saroya working on that painting, and it's a very large painting. It's 82 inches tall, and he's standing out in a park, and all that dappled sunlight. And it's a very brushy painting. If you could see it in real life, it has the sort of swashbuckling marks all across it. It's wonderful. Here's the King and Queen of Sweden, painted by Zorn in 1909 and 1898. King Oscar saw Zorn's work when he was at the Stockholm Academy when he was quite young, and he bid for a painting that unfortunately he didn't get. So fast forwarding about 2 decades, he ends up, commissioning him to paint his own portrait. And all three of them painted US presidents, as I mentioned. This is Sargent's painting of Teddy Roosevelt in 1903. And that painting to this day still hangs in the White House. And then on the right, we have President Woodrow Wilson's portrait, painted during World War I. In fact, Sargent didn't charge a fee. The money he would have charged, he donated to the Red Cross and to the war effort. And here are Zorn's paintings of President Grover Cleveland and his wife of 1899. That painting on the left is in the Hall of Presidents in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's really worth seeing. It's a fantastic painting up close. And here I'm sort of doing a little comparison of Zorn's painting on the right of William Taft, and on the left is Saroya's painting of 1909. That's an important year because later on, I'm going to come back to that year when Saroya had a huge retrospective in New York City, and that's one of the reasons he got invited to paint that portrait. Ironically, all three of these artists eventually grew wary of the demands of commission portraiture, of having to deal with those pompous and prickly personalities of high society. In fact, all three artists would rather paint landscapes and or seascapes populated with their friends or family and relatives and or even peasants, because they were non-judgmental, essentially the antithesis of the movers and shakers of high society. On this painting here on the left, which is called Checker or Chess Game, one of those ladies is Sargent's niece, and on the right, this was one of the peasants in Zorn's in his little town called Mura. Another unusual irony is that while all three of these artists were famous for their dexterous skill at capturing the essence of an individual or a scene with an apparent effortlessness, shortly after their deaths in the first quarter of the 20th century, all three of these artists who were so widely acclaimed fell into obscurity. And you might wonder, well, why would that happen if they were so famous? And it's because the aesthetic tastes of the 20th century by 1925 had largely embraced abstraction over naturalism. Nevertheless, between 1900 and 1910, the Spaniard Sorolla was far more widely revered as compared to his fellow countryman Pablo Picasso, who in 1910, as you might know, was coming up with Georges Braque. They had invented Cubism, and coupled with Henri Matisse and his Fauves, Wild Beasts, had revolutionized the art world. Only relatively recently, particularly the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 decades, has there been such a revival and a reappreciation of the brushy naturalism associated with this triumphant triad of Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn. My slide lecture this evening is organized to show a comparison and contrast of these three artists, revolving primarily around Sargent, who was 4 years older than Zorn and a full 7 years older than Sorolla. Plus, Sargent happened to outlive both Sorolla and Zorn by 9 years. Therefore, I'm going to begin with Sargent, showing his early development. In fact, you see on the left here a plaster cast drawing, and on the far right, a life drawing from the live model. And what we have in between is a little watercolor when he was between 13 and 14 years old. He painted that, and that's partly because Sargent's mother was a very accomplished watercolorist. In fact, my friend Richard Orman, who is the foremost authority on Sargent, he has told me that there's an exhibition being organized right now of Sargent's mother, and to be compared because of her watercolors. They weren't really ever exhibited in her lifetime. People who were fairly well-to-do, and they were well-to-do, they were Americans. Sargent's father was a doctor. She had had a miscarriage, and so what happened is they left New England and they moved abroad, and they were sort of like wealthy vagabonds. They would travel around Europe. So when it was warm, they would find themselves in the northern climes and up in the mountain regions. And when it was hot, they would be where it was much warmer down in the south. So in January 12th, 1856, they happened to be in Florence when young John was born. His mother taught him how to work in watercolor and, in sketch. And she saw how prolific he was, and that at a certain point, he needed to move on to an academy. So by the time John was 18, he was enrolled in Paris at Carol's Duran's Academy, which incidentally had quite a number of young Americans studying there. Duran promoted study of the old masters such as Rembrandt and Frans Hals and Velázquez, among others. However, he particularly championed Diego Velázquez, and he encouraged his students to study these artists from life. Therefore, Sargent, listening to his teacher, made a trip to Spain to study and copy masterpieces such as Las Meninas. It's an enormous painting, 10.5 feet tall by 9 feet. Sargent's copy that you see here is 44 and 3/4 inches by almost 40 inches. by the way, Las Meninas was painted in 1656, exactly 200 years before Sargent was even born. But this massive size and bravura brushwork is what greatly influenced Sargent and later Sorolla, who was, of course, the younger artist. They both idolized the Spanish master and copied numerous works by Velázquez. In fact, here's another copy of Velázquez by Sargent. And I want you to compare this Velázquez study by Sargent with Sorolla's. It's a close-up, but it's quite similar. And you can see early on, in fact, Sorolla is not even 20 when he paints this painting. So I'll just go back once. This is the larger version that Sargent's taking from Velázquez's painting, and this is a condensed version by Sorolla. In addition to copying masterworks, Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn would have been painting live models, such as you see on the left there. By the way, I just saw that painting last week again at the Metropolitan Museum. I went there before, while I was gearing up to present this lecture. I wanted to see if it was hanging out, but it was in the room where they have all of these paintings hanging in these racks behind glass, so visitors can go and actually see paintings that aren't hanging out in the main rooms. The painting on the right, oh, and also what I wanted to say about that painting is that when I looked at it very closely, I don't know if you can tell it in the slides, this is the trouble of presenting a lecture online as opposed to when I do these live lectures where I can have the images blown up to a really large scale. You probably can't tell the thick impasto. I suspect Sargent painted over one of his earlier student paintings, this live model. Now on the right, this is a really good example. It's called Two Wine Glasses, and Sargent's only 18 and 19 years old when he executes this. But it's a very good example of warm and cool atmospheric color effects. What do I mean by that? It's essentially, you see the tablecloth, you naturally assume that's a white tablecloth. You see the dappled sunlight on it, and you also see that bluish color. It's sort of like the blue shadows on snow. It's the ambient light from the cool blue sky coming down onto the top of the tablecloth. And then as it turns over the edge, it is reflecting the dirt floor of the gazebo. And so there's this warm yellowish kind of tone on the side of the cloth. Sargent pays homage to his teacher Duran, himself a fashionable portrait painter. And Sargent does this painting of Duran. And of course, Duran is flattered to be portrayed by his star student. Sargent, I think, was very calculating because he paints this of this already well-known teacher, and Sargent gets it accepted to the Salon of 1879. And of course, people going to the Salon, these cultural elite, would recognize Duran because he himself is already a well-known painter. And so it ends up winning an honorable mention. And in fact, later Sargent portraits were often compared to this, as they called it, a youthful genius. Oh, what I wanted to mention is I'm going to be showing some images. I'll have details like this here, and that's because I think it's a good idea to see that while these paintings look really realistic and naturalistic from afar, when you see them up close, they're all about the intrinsic quality of paint on canvas. A ring will be reduced to a few little daubs and dashes, or that cuff around his sleeve, or that walking stick. So let me just get back to where I was. Here we are. Besides studying those old masters, Sargent and others would have been exposed to contemporary art currently being exhibited in Paris at that time. In addition to seeing Manet, Monet, and the other period of time, they would have seen Jules Bastien Lepage, who had made a significant impact on a lot of artists of his generation. Unfortunately, he didn't live very long. As you can see, his dates are 1848 to 1884. So Sargent would have seen these in the late 70s, early 80s, just before his death. This particular painting, it's a huge painting. Jeanne d'Arc is in the Metropolitan Museum. Every time I go, I stand spellbound in front of this masterpiece. It's so naturalistically painted. And what I mean by that is he handles the foliage one way. It's very, looks like blades of grass. And then he handles the dress or the linen another way. And he handles the face another way. And they're all handled very naturalistically. So the skin is much more smoothly painted than, say, the foliage. Where is my mouse here? I got to be able to advance. Let's see. There we go. So Sargent would have put into practice that plein air approach that he saw in Lepage with this painting, Oyster Gatherers. Incidentally, there are two versions of this. This is the larger of the two. And what I want to emphasize here is that while it was painted on plein air or outdoors, it isn't just knocked off in a single afternoon. No, in fact, I've seen numerous studies of starting with little sketches to studies of those first two people in the foreground, the lady and the little boy. And then I've seen pictures of the other groups of people. And so Sargent would do these studies, then he would organize this composition and put them all together like that. After having been to Spain, where Sargent witnessed some of the Moorish exoticness of the Alhambra, he traveled to North Africa. Incidentally, I too have painted in the Alhambra, and later on in the slide lecture, I'm going to show you numerous paintings that all three of the artists painted in that wonderful place in southern Spain where the Moors settled. But anyway, Sargent was in search of his next subject painting for the Salon of 1880. So he's knocking off little paintings like you see here as he comes up with Fumé d'Ambre Gris of 1880. It's a tour de force of a white-on-white painting, and it too received critical praise from the critics at the Salon. So on the left, you have the full painting, very naturalistically painted, very much like Lepage in a way. And then on the right, I'm showing you a detail so that hopefully you can ascertain just how brushy, like say those silver amulets hanging around her neck are. It was a very exotic kind of scene. What she's doing is she's taking the incense, the fumes from the incense under her hood there. This portrait of Dr. Pozzi on the right, it's a large painting, as you can see, 80.5 inches tall. He was a rather dashing, dandy gynecologist who reputedly had affairs with a number of his women patients, including Madame Gautreau. Pozzi eventually owned 3 other portraits by Sargent, including the study you see on the left called The Toast, which is of Madame Gautreau. Pozzi was the first Sargent painting, or portrait rather, to be shown at the Royal Academy in London. Because remember, Sargent is studying in Paris at this time. And unfortunately, it was shown to little fanfare. And then he takes it out of London and he enters it in another exhibition in Brussels. And I'm going to read a quote of what it was about, what it was said. The critic said of this, quote, "It has style and swagger, although there is too much stylishness. It's too theatrical. It's affected, and like a glass of champagne poured too quickly, it contains more froth than golden wine." I think that's a great comment, but that shows you what Sargent and all these artists were up against. They were very critical. Now, what do you see here? This is just one of probably a couple of hundred studies that Sargent was making, both drawings. They start off usually as charcoal sketches, then they turn in sometimes oil or watercolor studies, and then they go to these little oil studies. And these would just be parts of a painting as he's working up a composition. So even while he's working on that painting of Dr. Pozzi, Sargent's working on these numerous compositional sketches for the next big painting he wants to enter into the Salon. And he keeps going bigger. He keeps getting more ambitious each time. And the painting that he eventually chooses, he decides upon what he wants to say about the Spanish dance. And that is this huge painting, 11.5 feet long, which, by the way, is at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. So if you go there, you get to see this painting along with a number of others. This painting's enormous size and ferocious energy took the Salon of 1882 by storm, where along with Manet's Bar Folie Bergère became the two most talked about paintings in the Salon. Sargent had painted something new and dynamic, and as Richard Orman has written, quote, "It was a subversive work, elevating a low-life subject to the level of high art and painting it as a huge blow-up sketch. Sargent's bravura performance swept people off their feet," end quotes. The critics described it as, quote, "audacious, fantastic, fearless, stunning, original, reckless, preposterously clever." And regardless of its lack of finish, most of the critics agree that it was indeed a tour de force painting. It really was a knockout, and it still is to this day. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's so wild and crazy to have that arm in that sort of impossible position, as you can see in that little sketch here. In fact, I'll just go back a moment. You see it in this painting. By the way, she's life-size in the painting. And they have it lit in a very nice way. They have it lit in the museum just the way it's lit in Sargent's painting, with the lights coming up from underneath instead of coming down from the top. So on the right here, we have a portrait that's also hanging in the Metropolitan Museum. It's in the same room where Madame X or Madame Goutre is hanging. This one's called Lady with the Rose, and it's a portrait of Charlotte Marie's Burckhardt. She and Sargent had a bit of a romance going, and again, Richard Orman told me that he thought that the romance may have been fostered by Louise's mother, because she sensed young Sargent was going to have a brilliant career because he had been having all this great success at the Salon. Nevertheless, apparently by the end of the decade, their romance had fizzled, and she ends up marrying an Englishman. However, after a long honeymoon in fashionable cities all over Europe, she becomes ill and she dies in Paris just 18 months later. It's really quite sad. Incidentally, she's adopting a pose. She's dressed all in black, and Sargent, again, being influenced by Velázquez, he's looking at a painting called Calabasas by Velázquez, and in which although it's a male figure, he is dressed in black, and he's assuming a pose similar to what Miss Burckhardt has assumed here. Sargent still owes a debt to Velázquez in terms of the evocative and mysterious darkness found in paintings such as this Venetian Interiors. Between 1880 and 1882, Sargent spent time doing a number of paintings in Venice, but always kind of under the influence of Velázquez. So he does this, and what this is doing is this is sort of leading up. I'm going to show you several other ones, but it's leading up to his next big portrait painting, this one, the Boit children, the daughters of Edward Boit. The square, you notice it's a square format, 87 by 87 inches. The square format of the composition was considered really radical and eccentric at that time. You have the little girl on the left, her name was Mary, counterbalanced by that red screen and the Japanese vase on the far right of the painting. And while Sargent wouldn't have known it at the time, none of these girls that he portrayed here when they were little girls ever married. In fact, Florence and Jane, the two girls enshrouded in the shadows in the middle of the painting, they lived rather emotionally disturbed and troubled lives. One of them actually had to be institutionalized. So I think it's pretty incredible that Sargent has this kind of psychological thing going on that he wasn't probably even aware of, or at least I don't think he was. How could he have been? But Julie, on a happier note, the little girl on the rug that I have the detail of with holding her little dolly, she becomes a very accomplished watercolorist, somewhat emulating her father, Edward Boit, who was, as I say, a friend of John's. And Boit, many years later, talked John Singer Sargent into exhibiting his watercolors. He had never exhibited his watercolors. He just did them for on holidays and for fun and as sketches. He hadn't even signed most of them or framed them. Well, Voigt decided that he should have a show of his watercolors because they were really cutting edge. And he ends up having one at the Brooklyn Museum in 1909, and they buy almost all of the paintings, which actually rather upsets the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, because they always sort of considered Sargent their boy, because Sargent had been working on these Boston library murals, and then later he does the murals on the ceiling in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Let me just take a glass of water here. Saroya's painting of his family also illustrates the influence of Velázquez. That's the one on the left. That's you can see Saroya in the background there, reflected in the mirror, and this is his wife and children. The painting on the right, the kind of darkness with Zorn's wife kind of in the background, or maybe it's just a model, but I suspect it might be his wife because it's 1896, and he often used his wife as a model. I think he is now looking at Sargent quite a bit, especially in 1896. He was very competitive and trying to garner the kind of clientele that Sargent had. But you will notice, if you look closely, that since he's holding his palette, there's only black, red, yellow ochre, and a white. Zorn became famous for this limited palette painting. He could do a whole painting with just intermixtures of those colors. And while he's not using blue, you look in that painting and you see in the cool tones that it almost appears bluish in comparison to, say, the flesh colors or the floor. So he's really very effective with that small number of colors. Now, that's not to say he didn't use blue ever. He would when he, say, had to paint a blue rug or something in somebody's home. Here's another one of those Venetian interior paintings, which I happen to love. This painting is at the Albert Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And here's another one. I'd like you to compare this Venetian interior with one of Zorn's paintings called The Little Brewery. Zorn, incidentally, Zorn's father was a Bavarian brewer, although Anders never knew his father because his father only had a short love affair with Anders' mother when Zorn's father came up to Sweden one summer, and it was never his intention to marry her. So he goes back down to Germany, and so the boy grows up never knowing who his father is. He's raised by his mother and his grandparents. Here's another painting on the right by Zorn, also inside a brewery called the Old Rinse Shed. And you can compare that, and again, he's using that limited palette to create that painting. And on the left, you can compare it to, say, the cool bluish gray of the wall in the Sargent painting, which Sargent would have used blue to create that cool wall color. So I'm circling back to a pretty major portrait commission here. This is Mrs. Henry White, which was commissioned in part because she and her American diplomatic husband, residing in Paris at the time, happened to see Lady with a Rose, the painting I showed you earlier of Mrs. Burkhart, or Miss Burkhart. This was commissioned after seeing that painting at the Salon of 1882. Coincidentally, Mr. White later becomes the American ambassador to London, and he makes the introduction of Sargent to Theodore Roosevelt, who wants to commission Sargent to paint his portrait in 1903, which I've already shown you. I like showing, when I was an art student in 1970, Richard Orman's first book on Sargent came out, and I was thumbing through the art stacks in the library on the campus, and I came upon this new book. And in those days, you know, it was expensive to print with a lot of color reproductions. And so there were a lot of paintings in just black and white, including Mrs. White. But Richard Orman had put in this particular detail from that painting, and it made a huge impact on me because I had been looking at, and my teacher, Jim Herbert, was a big abstract expressionist painting. I'd been looking at de Kooning and Pollock and all these guys. And yet I saw something in Sargent's paintings that had an affinity to that. It was all about the intrinsic quality of paint on canvas. And while it looks very naturalistic from a distance, when you get up close, if anything, it's only suggested detail. He isn't picky details at all. And that's the same for all three of these artists. So while Mrs. White was a fairly straightforward painting without too many complications and also garnered good reviews by the critics, that unfortunately cannot be said for Madame Goutreau's portrait. This is probably the most famous portrait Sargent ever painted and the most notorious. Sargent was completely beguiled by the unusual beauty and striking profile of this young American lady who had come over from New Orleans. She married a Frenchman. She was somewhat of a social climber. And so she thought Sargent, who had been having all this great success in the salon, would help her reputation as she climbed up the ladder into high society. Well, it completely backfired. Sargent painted many different studies until he pared it down to this dramatic, rather severe pose and minimalist background. He even painted her with not only that plunging neckline, but one of the straps off the shoulder. And while that doesn't seem like anything compared to the costumes Lady Gaga might be wearing today, in those days, it caused a huge scandal at the salon. It was so embarrassing for Sargent that he quickly tried to rectify the situation. He repainted the strap back upon her shoulder, but unfortunately, it was too little too late. Sargent became so depressed, he actually literally considered giving up painting altogether. Now, having said that, Richard Orman has told me that he was so gifted on the piano that he could have become a concert pianist if he had decided to go that route. But what he does instead is he decamps Paris and he moves over to England. As mentioned earlier, Anders Zorn was born out of wedlock on February 18th, 1860, so just next week, but back in 1860. And by the way, Saroya is also born in February, so it's rather apropos, I think, to have this lecture tonight in February, because last month, Sargent's was his birthday date on January 12th. And then Zorn is February 18th, and I will show you Saroya in a few moments. Anyway, he spent his youth in a little Swedish village that I visited called Mora, and that's pronounced that way. It's M-O-R-A. Unlike Sargent, he began his life under rather humble circumstances because his grandparents and his mother were caring for him. However, like Sargent, it was recognized early on that Anders had a real gift for drawing, as well as carving little figures out of wood. So in 1875, at the ripe old age of 15, he was accepted to the Swedish Academy of Art in Stockholm. Initially, he thought he'd become a sculptor. However, he soon excelled in watercolor at the Academy and pursued it passionately. And this is why he comes late to oil painting. The first watercolor to sell while he's still a student, and not even 20 years old yet, was In Mourning, the one on the left. This was competitively sought after by many, including the King of Sweden, but it ends up being bought by someone else. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Zorn does paint the king about 2 decades later. So what do we have on the right? This painting called Cousins, another watercolor, very fresh, very beautiful, very spontaneous looking. Shows you how accomplished he is in this medium. Then upon concluding his study at the Swedish Academy in 1881, like Sargent, Zorn also visits Spain and later Italy. I want you to compare that watercolor on the right of that Spanish dancer with the El Jaleo watercolor, or just even the huge oil painting by Sargent. It gives you a sense of what they were looking at and what was popular at that time. The landscape watercolors of Zorn's native Sweden show how versatile he can be and how amazingly lush the forests are up in Scandinavia. Incidentally, that's Emma Lamb, whom he is courting, and becomes, eventually he weds her. But before he weds her, Emma Lamb was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish businessman, and Zorn wanted to prove to him, so it didn't appear that he was going to be sort of living off the fat of the lamb, excuse the pun, but he goes running off to Paris and then to England. He does all these watercolors. He sells a great number of them. He returns to Sweden and shows Emma's father that he indeed could make his living as an artist. Therefore, they do become married in 1885, and they take their honeymoon in Constantinople. So what you see here is a painting of them being rowed around in Constantinople, and that's probably the Blue Mosque off in the distance. Or perhaps Hagia Sophia is in there as well. I've been there. It's an incredible place. And it's, of course, where sort of the Orient or the East meets the West, as they like to say. If you've not been, I would recommend it. Here are a couple other watercolors done while they're in Constantinople. The one on the right is actually of his wife, Zorn's wife, called The Tub. And I'd like you to try to remember this image, because later on I'm going to show you a Saroya painting that is quite similar in composition, the backside with her arm up like that. In 1887, the Zorns moved to Cornwall in England, where Zorn paints a number of the local fisher folk, as you can see here on the left, in the artistic community of St. Ives. The one on the right is from London. While he's in St. Ives that Zorn finally learns to paint in oil, and he does that painting that I had mentioned earlier, showing Emma reading the newspaper that you saw much earlier. At this juncture, I feel it's important to introduce Peter Croyer, that's K-R-O-Y-E-R, and his dates are 1851 to 1909. Croyer was a well-known Danish artist who influenced both Zorn and later Saroya, as can be seen in these few examples I'm going to show you right now. On the left, we have a painting, these Italian iron workers, and that's not wholly unlike the sort of scene that Saroya would paint with his when he's working on his social commentary series. And then on the right, this painting, the self-portrait of Croyer painting outdoors by the beach. It's just the sort of thing that both Zorn and Saroya would be doing. Here's a large painting. I took this picture inside the in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and it's about 6 feet across or so, and it's much more brushy than maybe it appears in this little image you see in the computer. This is one of Croyer's most famous paintings, painted 1899, of himself strolling along the beach with his wife. And of course, they comes from the land of the midnight sun, so this would be at that time of the year. Now, this is a Saroya painting. It's a large painting painted the same year, 1909, that Croyer dies. And that's why I purposely selected this particular painting, because Saroya, although it's painted in 1909, many years after those other paintings by Croyer, this one kind of shows the influence, albeit in sunny Valencia, Spain, along the beach. So Joaquín Sorolla was born February 27th, 1863, and his little sister in 1864. But just a year later, in 1865, they both lose their parents to a cholera epidemic. Luckily, there was an aunt and an uncle who was a locksmith, so they didn't have much money either, but they cared for these young children. And 13 years later, in 1876, it was recognized that Saroya too exhibited artistic talent. Therefore, his uncle helped enroll him in some drawing classes at night. And then later he went to a school in Valencia, whereupon he was about 16 or 17, he meets a well-known photographer named Antonio Garcia Perez. And he would become Sargent's sort of protector and patron during Saroya's younger years, when he'd be painting still lifes such as this at age 15, a mighty accomplished painting for a 15-year-old. I couldn't do that at 15. fact, I had never done a painting at 15. I'd only done drawings and maybe a little tempera thing in high school. So in 1881, he's not even 20 yet. Look how accomplished this is. He's already starting to really impress his teachers. Soon he's winning these prizes at various student exhibitions, and he travels to Madrid in 1881 to see the Prado, which is the huge museum where the Velázquez paintings are housed. And he'd return later to copy Velázquez, just as Sargent had done several years earlier. I want you to compare these two paintings. One is a painting after Velázquez, the one on the right by Sargent, and that's that Calabasas character. And then you can compare the palette with Saroya's painting, An Arab Examining a Pistol. Very similar palettes. The brush work is very similar also. So in 1864, he applied for a grant to study in Rome. And after the judges saw this painting I'm showing here, he won by a unanimous vote. He beat out all the other students. So he started it's also the same time period when he started his courtship with Clotilde, who was the third child of his patron, Antonio Garcias. Of the 5 children he had, it was the third child that Sorolla ends up marrying. So while studying in Rome, Sorolla also travels to Paris in 1885, where he visits and paints in numerous museums and is particularly taken by the naturalistic art of Bastien Lepage, whom I had shown you earlier. And I'd like you to compare this. I picked this particular little painting, which he painted outdoors in Paris, because it has a tabletop with some wine on top, not wholly unlike that little painting that I had shown you called Two Wine Glasses by Sargent. Sorolla continually enters competitions, not only in Spain, but also in Germany and France. In 1892, he wins a gold medal in Madrid for this painting, Another Marguerite. It's a social commentary painting about a woman who was accused of killing her child. So she's being taken in a railway carriage off to jail, and striving for realism, Sorolla actually paints this piece in a railway carriage. The next year, he wins a third-class gold medal in Paris for yet another social commentary work called Kissing the Relic that you see here. While I'm at it, I want to mention that while I was in Barcelona, I went to Picasso Museum, and they have a lot of early paintings by Picasso. You always think of his, shall we say, mature work. I don't know what you want to call it, the abstract work. But Picasso was so mature at age 15, he was doing paintings very similar to Sorolla, and he did one of a choir boy and a priest standing in a situation quite similar to this in this church. So Kissing the Relic also won a gold medal, as I mentioned, and Another Marguerite, the painting I had just shown you of the lady being carted off to jail, won at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 and was purchased by an American named Charles Nagel, and he donated that painting to Washington University. So at that same time, at that same World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago, Zorn wins a medal. This is where these artists start meeting each other. Their paths are crossing because they're entering the same competitions. And this little watercolor on the left, he actually wins an award for that. But at the same fair, this large painting called the Waltz, which is now hanging in the Biltmore House. That's still probably the largest, to my knowledge, it's the largest privately owned house in the United States, and it's in Asheville, North Carolina. If you've never have seen it, I highly recommend you seeing it. Not only is the essentially French chateau incredibly, just to marvel at, but so are all the paintings hanging in there. A number of Zorn and Sargent paintings hang there. Plus there are beautiful grounds you can tour. It's thousands of acres. It's really worth seeing. I have a couple of friends who are watching this lecture tonight who live in Asheville, so I am waving to them, and my other friends, an English couple that live over the mountaintop in Tennessee, and I've stayed with them before, and I'm raising I wish here's my glass until I finish the lecture, then I'll switch to wine. So I'm raising my glass to my friends who are down there near the Biltmore House. George Vanderbilt, who built the Biltmore House, bought that painting, and that's where that painting is housed. Isabella Stewart Gardner purchases the second version. And of course, these painters often, as you saw with the Oyster Gatherers back with that Sargent painting, they do numerous studies or different versions often of the same painting. In this particular piece, the one on the right that Isabella Stewart Gardner bought for her collection, she chose the one that was more avant-garde, with that streak of sunlight entering the omnibus carriage, creating that kind of abstract triangular streak of light on her face. In addition to nudes and portraits, Zorn also loved painting genre scenes in his local community of Murra. Baking bread was painted in his home, and I can remember standing in that very kitchen looking at that same table and just being sort of bowled over by I love the interior of his home with all that wood paneling everywhere. Europeans and American audiences seemed enamored by these genre scenes, and they would snap them up. And in so doing, Zorn had a knack for, creating the buzz about his paintings, and he would often get portrait commissions after selling scenes like you see here to potential patrons. So, circling back to Sargent, as you know, he decamped with his sort of tail between his legs, as it were, and he ends up moving into a little Cotswolds village called Broadway in England, where he paints with his friend Edward Austin Abbey, who's a very well-known illustrator. The Metropolitan Museum has a great painting of his, but here, while he's in Broadway, he's not doing portrait painting at all. He's just not doing that. Instead, he's painting his friends and his friends' children, which he's doing here. This is a fairly large painting called Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose. He works on this painting almost the entire summer because he only paints for about 20 minutes a day, right at dusk, right at the time when those little girls would be lighting those lanterns. Well, he worked on it so long, he jokingly called Carnation and Lily, Lily, Rose, damnation, silly, silly pose. And however, it is not taken as a joke when it's exhibited at the Royal Academy, and he garners a lot of good press from this painting, which helps him sort of slowly enter back into painting portraits. And he's introduced to high society by his friend Henry James. Here's that painting that I promised I'd show you of his friend Monet painting a painting out in the woods. And I've seen an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston of this painting, and hanging next to this painting is Monet's painting that you see there on his easel that he's working on. So while he's painting that, Sargent is also painting paintings like this picture of his sister called The Morning Walk of 1888. Sargent had become quite good friends with Monet at this point, and he, as you can see, he's highly influenced. If you know Monet's famous painting, A Lady with a Parasol, it's very similar, that impressionistic palette, dappled sunlight, the warm and cool atmospheric effects ricocheting off that white gown that she's wearing. Same thing can be said for the Saroya portrait, painting of his daughter, painted outdoors she's dressed up like a farm worker, but in fact, that's his daughter posing for him. And that's a large painting, 74 inches tall, and painted in 1907. Another favorite painting of mine, which hangs in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, is this painting, Paul Helleu sketching his wife. The placement of that canoe and Helleu's arms set up a diagonal movement from top right corner, moving down through the lower left, coming across that canvas, circles back around that round circular straw hat that Helleu's wearing in this painting. Here is Sargent also wearing a straw hat, painting the portrait of his friend, and you see a detail there. He's standing among the reeds, and his paints are in that little basket down at his feet there in that photograph. I'd like you to compare this Zorn painting where you can see this cart and this road coming down the hill, turning left into this man in a drunken stupor with his wife waiting for him to wake up. I found this painting in the courthouse in Mura, and I decided this was probably Zorn's one and only painting as a social commentary on alcoholism. Of course, alcoholism was quite a rage in the Scandinavian countries because, of course, they're in the darkness like half the year, and it snows a lot, so they end up drinking a lot. In any case, Zorn also drank a lot. There's a little photograph of him working on the painting. Although the female nude was a staple in 19th century art and art academies, for the most part, the female nude was either painted indoors in art classes or perhaps as a femme fatale, such as in Courbet or Manet's painting. You might recall the famous Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or that picnic on the grass that Manet became notorious for, having the nude woman and then surrounded by two males dressed. Well, so except for instances like that, it was really Zorn who actually kind of modernized a nude, because often if you would see nudes outdoors, they would be portrayed as nymphs or perhaps as angels, and in paintings by Bouguereau and those neoclassical artists. Instead, Zorn was credited as modernizing the nude by painting her outdoors on location in the great outdoors, as it were. So here are a couple of other examples. She's undressing on the left, and the little painting on the right of a nude under a spruce tree was purchased by Charles Deering. Charles Deering's a big industrialist who is also a good friend of Sargent's. And his place, Vizcaya, down in Miami Beach, I don't know if you know it, but you can tour it, the public can tour it. It's worth seeing. Sargent did paintings down there, and of his friend, which I'll show you later. So here are a couple of other nudes by Zorn of 1894 and the summer evening. And at the same time, Saroya down in Spain continues to paint plein air studies, such as this painting here, studying for the return from the fishing. That painting's only 18 by 24 inches. However, he blows that painting up to 8 by 13 feet. He submits it to the French Salon of 1895, where it wins a gold medal. It is then bought by the French government, and it now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. So here is the large version of it. I'll go back. You can compare the little study that he did with the large version. And here are some of the close-ups showing some of that bravura brushwork. And here are 3 of the fishermen that are in that same painting. At the same time, Saroya continues to work on his social commentary paintings, such as, and this is his title, "And They Still Say Fish is Expensive." That title is being inspired by the social commentary literature of his friend that I showed you the portrait of, Blasco Ibanez. Obviously, this little young fisherman has been hooked, perhaps, and one of these other fishermen are attending to him in the bow of the boat. Other social subject paintings follow, such as White Slave Trade, which received praise and medals in various competitions throughout Europe and abroad. This little painting, it's not very big, 25 by 33 inches, and yet in Berlin, this won a big gold medal award. It's a fantastic painting. It's always been one of my favorite Saroya paintings. I like everything from the handling of the fishing nets to the fishermen and the water and the boat in the background. The whole thing is, I just think, perfect. Having said that, when I attended a Saroya retrospective exhibition in San Diego back in 1989, I was completely bowled over by not only the large size of Sewing the Sail, which you see here, it's 7 by 9 feet, But even more impressive is that tour de force handling of the large white sailcloth, which clearly takes up, well, more than a third, perhaps half of the painting surface. I was therefore surprised to read in my research on this painting that it wasn't fully understood or appreciated at the time that he painted it, perhaps because of the daring composition, which was probably just considered too abstract or discombobulated for those critics who were used to very, cleaned up and highly detailed paintings. This is a very brushy painting when you see it in real life. So what you see here is a little study for a painting called Sad Inheritance, which is going to become, Sad Inheritance, that is going to become Sorolla's most famous and last social commentary painting. He does this painting, this little study here, and by this point in time, Sorolla has become friends with Sargent. He gives this painting as a testament to their friendship to Sargent. Sargent reciprocates and gives Sorolla a painting, a study that he had done. They both keep these paintings for the rest of their lives, and when they die, they are found in their studios. This is Sad Inheritance. It's a large painting, 82 by 112 inches. It proves to be a very powerful painting that wins numerous awards throughout Europe and America. Yet when he was working on it, Sorolla becomes so saddened by seeing these little crippled children that the padre is helping in and out of the surf, that Sorolla decides he's never going to paint anything remotely like it again. And he just gives up on these social commentary paintings. He'd much rather paint these, happy peasants working in transporting grapes. I happen to love the way that shirt is handled. Fantastic handling of warm and cool atmospheric effects coming out of the shadows. In a related painting, Packing Raisins, I was immediately struck by the similarity in both the palette and the strong streak of sunlight that is found in Sargent's painting, which was painted 2 decades earlier, called Venetian Bead Stringers of 1880 to 82. Look at that abstract, strong sunlight going up that wall in the background. Let me go back to this painting. Sunlight is a big, important part of that painting, that diagonal. It's like an abstract component within this painting. And same thing in this painting by Sargent. A similar comparison of technique and palette can be found in Sargent's 1887 portrait of the writer Robert Louis Stevenson. Sargent did, to my knowledge, at least 3 paintings, one of which he destroyed of Stevenson. There's another one that I know of where Stevenson, who's tall and thin and also smoking, which is what kills him in the end. But he is pacing back and forth with his wife sitting in a couch, if you know that painting. I'm not sure if you do, but I'm not going to show you that right now, but I'm going to show you as a comparison with Zorn's painting of the intellectual Anton Proust, whom he paints in 1888, the next year. Both of these works exhibit a sort of a casual nonchalance to the sitters, posing, capturing sort of a momentary mood, as it were, emphasized by the spontaneous bravura brushwork. There is again a casual quality and nonchalance in how these 2 paintings by Sargent and Zorn are handled. As mentioned earlier, Zorn initially thought he'd become a sculptor. Therefore, he always had an affinity to that medium. He became friends with Auguste Rodin, who was the foremost sculptor of the era. And Zorn is also friends with a sculptor named Emil Wilkströms. And in fact, he paints this painting in Wilkström's studio. Now, Rodin was also good friends with Sargent, and Sargent does this sort of casual portrait of him just as a gift in a sense. But it's because Rodin coined the expression, the Van Dyck of our times. And I'm going to show you some paintings that lead up to that, actually. But before I do that, I want you to see these 2 paintings. These are very formal portraits where both these sitters have their hats in their hands and they have gloves on, or at least one of them does. as you recall, Zorn never forgot his roots as a son of a German brewer. Therefore, he became friends and he courted these German brewers. Adolphus Busch of the Busch Reisinger fame. In fact, Busch's daughter marries Hugo Reisinger, and they both become collectors of Zorn. So he's done this portrait that you see here of Hugo. And on the right, we have a portrait of one of Saroya's good friend, who was a landscape painter. But more importantly, Baruti happened to be a very important judge at the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1899. And he is one of the judges who awards Saroya his most famous and most important award, the Grand Prize for Sad Inheritance, the big painting of those little crippled children that I showed just a few moments ago. What's more impressive almost is that in addition to Sad Inheritance winning the grand prize, the other painters who also won awards in this same exposition were none other than Croyer, Sargent, and Zorn. You can compare these two portraits of Saroya. One's a self-portrait, 1900, and the other one is just 1906 by Zorn, again using his famous limited palette to create that little portrait of Zorn with the red ear. So I've got a portrait here by William Merritt Chase. He is someone who had a studio out here in the Hamptons, just down the street from where I lived. And I'm currently putting together research that I'm going to eventually mount a slide lecture like I'm doing tonight, only it'll be on William Merritt Chase, who is painted by Sargent here. And Chase was a famous portrait painter as well as a famous teacher. So it's Chase's students who actually commissioned Sargent, which flattered Chase because Chase really admired Sargent. He thought he was the greatest portrait painter of the era. And when I do my lecture, I'm also going to do it on another famous painter who had a studio out here, and that would be Thomas Moran. But I'll get to that at another time when I do the portrait. When I do the lecture. On the right, we have this portrait of Edward Robinson. You might want to know who he is. He is, in fact, a classical scholar. He's an archaeologist. He's educated at Harvard. He becomes a museum director at the famous MFA, that's the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And later he becomes the museum director at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He also serves on a committee helping to acquire contemporary art in addition to old master paintings. And he uses Sargent connoisseurship to help advise him as he is collecting works to put into the MFA museum. In fact, Sargent's painting called In the Studio, which I'll show you later, is one that Edward Robinson selects to bring into the Museum of Fine Arts as a contemporary piece. Having had success with Carnation Lily Lily Rose, Sargent begins to slowly paint portraits again, and that's in part because of his friend and fellow American expatriate Henry James, the famous writer, who helps introduce Sargent to high society. Upon completing Lady Agnew of Lochnaw, which is actually housed in, or it lives in the Edinburgh in the Royal Academy there, or the museum there. And I used to see it all the time because when I was living and teaching in England, and I was just across the border in England, I would take weekend trips because I had cultivated a relationship and was exhibiting in Edinburgh. And so while I would go and visit my art dealer in Edinburgh, I would always stop in the museum and I would see this painting among many others. Anyway, when this painting was exhibited in 1893, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. The London Times called it, quote, a masterpiece, not only a triumph of technique, but the finest example of portraiture in the literal sense of the word that has been seen here in a long while. The confident and spontaneous looking broad brushstrokes, coupled with the subtle harmony of nuanced color within the beautiful face, dress, and lavender sash, produce an overall effect that is so eloquently assured it appears effortless. Well, with such high praise as this from the critics and public alike, Sargent's career as a portrait artist took off, especially among the aristocracy. He had indeed become the Van Dyck of his era. Throughout the 1890s, through the first decade of the 20th century, Sargent was in high demand for portrait commissions. Although Sargent and particularly Zorn, although Saroya and particularly Zorn were not far behind, I'd like you to compare these next few paintings that I'm going to show of Saroya and Zorn and Sargent with this painting by Saroya or Sargent here. Sorry, I'm mixing up my S's. Zorn's painting on the left is 101 inches. And I think the reason he painted that at such a large size, because he really wanted to try to compete against that painting you see on the right there, which is 93 inches tall. I find it somewhat debatable that Sargent really wins the day, because it's somewhat debatable anyway, because when you compare the complicated multi-figure portrait you see on the right here of Sargent's Mrs. Carl Mayer and her children, painted in 1896, with Zorn's portrait of Mrs. Donald Cameron of 1900, Zorn clearly is influenced by the earlier Sargent painting in how the figure is positioned with the feet crossed, the arm outstretched over the couch, and right down to that oriental fan that both ladies are holding. That competitive streak doesn't seem to be present in the sunny, affable Saroya, at least not in the portraits that I see of Saroya. In this portrait of his daughter, Maria, the attitude is casual and elegant. By the way, this painting, which is quite large, when I was living and teaching in California, as I say, I went to that big retrospective of Saroya's. This painting was the first painting that the Museum of Fine Arts in San Diego purchased from Europe, and it was a Saroya painting, this particular painting. Anyway, you can compare it with the very formal portrait of the Duchess of Portland that's 90 inches tall by Sargent. But I only put them in because they're both tall paintings, but it's a different handling. One's a formal portrait and one's a portrait of one's daughter, Saroya's daughter. They're both fantastic paintings though. There is one painting, however, in which Zorn's competitiveness wins out over Sargent, and that is this painting on the right, which now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Mrs. Walter Rathbone Bacon of 1897, whom Sargent had painted just the year before. While sailing across the Atlantic, Zorn happened to meet the railroad magnate, Mr. Bacon, and he challenged Zorn to paint a better portrait of his wife, Virginia, who had posed for Sargent the year before. And that had been commissioned by Virginia's uncle, who was George Vanderbilt. So that painting on the left also hangs in Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. Anyway, what Zorn decided to do is, because he decided to rise up to this challenge, he started studying very closely Sargent's paintings, these big paintings he was doing of the high society. And he enters this painting in 1897. Not only did it garner great praise, it also impressed Mr. and Mrs. Bacon to no end. And when Sargent sees it, he concedes, and he says of this, quote, "Zorn has won a brilliant victory with this painting." This, of course, satisfies Zorn to no end, because he finally feels that he can step out of that long shadow cast by Sargent in the international market for high society portraiture. Nevertheless, just 2 years later, in 1899, Sargent paints the grandiose, great group portrait of the Wyndham sisters, which also hangs in the today, anyway, it hangs in the Metropolitan Museum, and I just saw it the other day. so with this painting, there's not only does Sargent paint these lovely sisters, he also paints their mother, who, albeit, is hanging in the shadows. And that was painted by George Frederick Watts, who was the portrait painting artist of that particular era of the sister's mother. These ladies were extremely wealthy. The whole family was. They're high society. They count among their friends the Prime Minister of England, as well as Henry James, Oscar Wilde, Edward Burne-Jones, and many, many others. I'm showing you this picture of Mr. and Mrs. Fitzwarren mainly because I have a black and white photograph. This illustrates where Sargent places his painting relative to the sitters. It's not far away. He actually puts it quite close to the sitters. And what he does is he retreats after he makes one of these sort of swashbuckling maneuvers with his brush. He then retreats. He looks at the painting and he looks at the sitters from the same vantage point from afar, thereby being able to gauge those swashbuckling bravura brush marks on the canvas, which convey suggested detail, because when you get close to the painting, it's very, very brushy. Well, that's my little art history lecture for the day. Now, when around the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, as I had mentioned earlier, Sargent begins to tire of all these commissioned portraits of these pompous, prickly personalities. So therefore, he starts spending, and because he's really well off at this point, he starts declining portrait commissions and starts spending more time with his friends, such as the de Glens or his Italian friend Raphael, with whom he paints, and similar paintings that you see here, including that detail of the painting at the top, very brushy. These paintings show a certain kind of freedom and lively expressionistic execution that's not always apparent in the commission portraits, because of course, as Sargent often said, a painting, and he was of course doing this in sort of a derogatory manner, he says, a painting is something not quite right about the mouth. A portrait painting, that is. One of my favorite of these paintings that he does on these holidays is the Brook, which is also on one of my Sargent books. In fact, my computer is resting on top of that Sargent book even as I speak. In any case, Sargent has painted this portrait of his nieces with wild abandon. And if you could see it up close, it's really, really brushy. And it makes one wonder, with all that impasto, was he reworking an area until he got it correct? Or just perhaps he had to quit when his nieces got tired and couldn't continue to go on painting? There he is actually painting the portrait of them by the brook. One large commission that both embraces portraiture and landscape on location is the nearly 8-foot wide On His Holidays, which in fact was commissioned by George McCullough of his son Alexander. McCullough was an avid fly fisherman, and he loved fishing for salmon. So he talks Sargent into going up to Norway, and Sargent's not a particularly great fisherman, but he goes along to work out numerous studies of McCullough's son until he arrives at this composition that you see here. When this painting is exhibited later on, the Spectator praised it for, quote, its technical mastery, subtlety of modeling, grace in design, as well as evoking the freedom of life out of doors, end quote. Given that it was painted in Norway, I think it makes for a fair comparison with Zorn's Outdoors of 1888. Note the same pinkish atmospheric color that permeates the rocks, flesh, clothes, and water in both paintings. Let me go back to the Sargent. You see that sort of pinkish tone. This is what helps configure all of these disparate elements together. That pink tone is in the rocks, it's in the water, it's in the shirt, it's in the salmon. And in the same thing here, it's in the water, it's in the flesh, it's on the rocks of the Zorn painting. In the early 20th century, Saroya was painting considerably more along the seashore. He was done with those social commentary paintings. and started just painting what he loved to paint, which was down by the seashore and kids playing in the surf and that sort of thing. This particular painting that I chose, I really love it because of those colorful atmospheric effects, which look very plausible, even though he's pushing that color. By the way, Saroya was known as the painter of sunlight, and you can really see it here. And you can see it here. Now, when you look at this painting, it's 1905. Picasso's starting to experiment and paint kind of abstractly, but these little paintings, which actually aren't so little, like this painting is almost 5 feet across, and these paintings aren't painted from photographs. These are painted from life. He's standing either on a dock or in a boat or wherever to paint these kids playing in the water with all those abstract component pieces because of the distortion that occurs of the bodies being splashing about in those waves. And even in this painting right here, which is 6 feet across, he's painting these kids on the beach playing in the surf. And I love the abstraction that occurs with the, in the sand that's awashed and it's wet, you see the sort of reflections there. It's very abstract. It's a very avant-garde kind of painting at this time. And this is 1910. It's the same time, the same year that Picasso is starting to embrace Cubism and do those great paintings. Look at this little study. I just want to go back. I forgot to mention this. That painting of the figure at the top, of course, this painting is 1910. Sargent had done a very similar study when he painted some little child on the beach in 1878. So you see a painting like this, it's 80 by 98 inches, and you think, that painting can't be painted in real life. Well, there he is. That's a photograph of Saroya actually working on that painting out there at the beach. The next few paintings I'm going to show just show you, because Sargent and Saroya had become great friends by this point, and their palettes and even what they paint is very similar. These marine-based kind of paintings of the boats. I have actually stood on that horseshoe harbor in Lake this was in not Como, Garda, Lake Garda, I think it was, and that. Where you see it in the background there, that used to be, it's now a hotel and I've stayed there, but it used to be Winston Churchill would paint there. It was a private residence, and also Sargent would paint there. I want to keep moving on. This painting of Sargent's wife and his daughters, and this painting by Sargent. Here are two comparison and contrast. You can maybe, I hope you can discern some of that very brushy, abstract kind of what I call bravura brushwork that exists in both of these paintings. The reason I put this painting in, well, besides I liking it, and that's his friend Ambrosio Raffaele, who was also a very good painter, is because Sargent makes a black and white postcard and scribbles on it, wishing his friend Saroya Happy New Year in 1916. Meanwhile, World War I is going on. So what I'm showing you here now is they're all painting in the same place. This is the Alhambra, where I also painted in 1983, but this is back in 1887, 1879, 1909. And then also they all three painted in Venice. This is a great painting by Zorn, I think, of 1894. I think Isabella Stewart Gardner may own that painting. I think that's where I remember seeing it. There's another one, and Sargent painting in the streets of Venice. This one's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. You can see it there. I love that sort of lascivious grins there as they eye this woman with a shawl walking down the street of one of those back alleys in Venice. And there's a little Venetian painting by Saroya. So all three I'm painted in Venice. Here's a couple of watercolors. And once again, we have joined Sargent sitting in the gondola as he is painting his friends, the de Glens, who are sitting in the gondola in front of him. I want to compare and contrast again these couple of paintings by Zorn notice the palette. Now he's painting this up in Sweden in the height of the summer when it's the land of the midnight sun. And Sargent's painting this in the Tyrol Austrian mountains, but the palette and the handling is very similar. It's almost as if those two hikers, which you see at the bottom, laid out on the grass there, resting from their hike up the hill, they seem to be sort of incidental compared to the scene that Sargent's painting. He's more interested, I think, in just these abstract shapes of the shadow and lights and the deep mountain vista and all of that. This painting, which I saw just a week ago in the Metropolitan Museum, is one of my favorite little paintings that he painted also in Austria and the Tyrol, as these people are saying grace before they have lunch. And there's a little detail. Compare these to this Zorn painting, the nude drying off. And I'm trying to show a detail to show you that impasto paint and that spontaneous brushwork. All right, here's the painting on the right. If you recall the painting I mentioned of Zorn's that he painted of his wife back in Constantinople when she's taking a bath, here's the painting by Saroya that's a very similar pose. And of course, on the left, two ladies drying off in front of a fire in Sweden by Zorn. Here's Zorn's painting his friend, again, Ambrosio Raphael, inside probably what would have been a hotel room. They had probably started the painting outside in the landscape, and maybe it was raining, who knows what, but for whatever reason, Sargent does this really great painting, which is in the Museum of Fine Arts. This was the painting that Edward Robinson bought as one of the first contemporary paintings that entered the collection in the early 1900s. And here's Saroya's painting of his friend, Louis Comfort Tiffany. Yes, the same Tiffany of Tiffany stained glass. Tiffany, in fact, was a painter, and there's some very good paintings of his in addition to his glass that are at the Metropolitan Museum and the Brooklyn Museum. Now, I'm showing a few etchings here because Zorn differs greatly from Sargent and Saroya in that Zorn excelled in etching as a way to have an aftermarket of images often associated with his paintings. Isabella Stewart Gardner owns that little etching on the right because she owns the painting that etching was made from. And why is if you don't know much about etching, it's essentially you scratch into a copper surface, you ink it up, you wipe off the ink, you put the paper on, you run it through a press, the press presses the ink down into the crevices of all the little scratches, and you end up with the image that you see here, which reverses the image. So on the left, we have a self-portrait with his wife, and on the right, the painting the omnibus that Isabella Stewart Gardner owns. This is Augustus St. Gaudens. He was a famous sculptor, probably the most well-known artist of the era. He sculpted Lincoln and many others, and especially the famous what am I trying to say? Up in the Boston Commons, he does the black infantry, all those infantrymen going off to all be killed in the Civil War. And if you know the film Glory, that was based on Augustus St. Gaudens' statue. Anyway, here's Teddy Roosevelt, also by Zorn, and Rodin again by Zorn. But where he really cleans up, makes lots of extra cash, he does these nudes, which they snap up. And a couple of years ago, I was in the University Club, and I saw about 15 or 20 of them, a grouping of them on this wall in the bar in the University Club. Here's one of Zorn's last portraits. It's painted when he's 55. He's only 55, but as you can see, he has grown rather rotund because he lived life very large. He'd smoke and drank like a fish. He partied till all hours, and by the age of 60, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. So there he is in his studio or in his home, and there's a color photograph of his home from 2015 when I was there, and then one of Zorn's paintings done in his home. And here he is astride his steed in 1917 in the winter in front of his home. And then my picture with one of his statues taken in 2015. So now we're getting down near the end. Here is one of my favorite little self-portraits where Saroya is looking very determined. He's got this determination that I know, because when I've done self-portrait, you just stare at yourself and there he is. And that's all it is. Straightforward, very brushy, very spontaneous and fresh. So in 1908, Saroya mounts a one-person exhibition at the Grafton Galleries in London, where he met the American patron of arts, Archer Huntington, who was the founder of the Hispanic Society in America. Huntington proceeds to buy several of the paintings from this exhibition, and he invites Saroya to mount a huge retrospective at the Hispanic Society in the next year in 1909. Saroya displayed, get this, 356 paintings, which he ships over from Spain, plus, and 170,000 people attend this exhibition at the Hispanic Society. The show does so well, it continues on up to Boston and also Buffalo. By the end of the run, Saroya has sold 195 paintings, 26 of them to Huntington and the Hispanic Society, and Saroya makes $181,760. That was, my friends, a vast fortune in 1 year to do all those paintings. So not only was he a great success that year in America, he also is introduced to President Howard Taft because he had been so successful, and he ends up painting the president's portrait in the White House. Huntington in 1911 signs a contract with Saroya to paint murals for the Hispanic Society. And I've been there, and if you come to New York, I'd be happy to take you there. It's really worth seeing. It's up in Spanish Harlem, which is around 150 something, and Broadway. Anyway, what you're looking at there, which I'm sorry it's so small, that is 11.5 feet tall by 45.5 feet long. That is one wall within, and there are 4 walls that are painted in the Hispanic Society. So Saroya starts this project. He paints these paintings individually. He rolls them up, he sends them, they then paste them up onto the wall as he adds them. The whole series is called The Vision of Spain. So what Saroya does is he goes all over Spain. It takes him about almost a decade to create all of these paintings for these murals. And let me just show you a couple more very quickly. That painting right there is 138 by 118 inches. The one to the right, 138 by 115 inches. And these are in different parts of Spain where he's painting these paintings. So everything is very brushy when you see these in real life. This is the last one of the series, painted in 1919, so about 9 years later. And that's 11 feet by 15 and a half, almost 16 feet actually. That painting is 1919. In 1920, and mind you, while Saroya is painting all these paintings, he's also painting portrait commissions, and he's painting friends, and he's just painting little studies for his pleasure. Well, all of this exertion, they think is what caused a stroke. But anyway, he suffers a massive stroke in 1920, and unfortunately, he doesn't ever paint again, and he dies in 1923. So what you see here are paintings in his home, which is now, this is in Madrid. This is, his home has become the Saroya Museum. You can tour this home, and you see on the right there, my daughter, Croyer, is admiring that Saroya painting that I showed you earlier, painted in 1909, that was based on the influence he had from Croyer. So Saroya and Sargent have died, but in 1920 and 1923. But Sargent is still chugging along, and he has pretty much given up portraiture, but every now and then he can't say no. And he cannot say no to his good friend, Henry James, whose friends commissioned Sargent to paint this portrait for his 70th birthday. Sargent accepts it, but what he does is he feels so sheepish about taking the money that what he does is he ends up buying some antique dishes, I think, and he also commissions Derwent Wood, who's a sculptor who sculpts a bust of Henry James. So James gets not only the portrait by Sargent for a birthday gift, but also a marble bust. By the way, that little detail you see of Sargent's portrait of Henry James, which I really love. I love the look in his face. One of these crazy suffragettes in London comes into the Royal Academy. I think it was the Royal Academy when it was on display, and she slices this painting with a knife right in the face, down by the corner of the mouth. Luckily, Sargent was on hand. He's brought back in, and he repairs the painting and fixes it up himself. And that painting, I think it still hangs in the Royal Academy. I'm not quite sure. Richard Orman would know. Two other notable prominent personalities that Sargent painted late in life were John D. Rockefeller on the left. Actually, he was commissioned by John D. Rockefeller's son to paint 5 different portraits, but Sargent only accepts 2 of them. And then the other painting that he's painted in 1917, in addition to the portrait you saw of the president that I showed you much earlier, is his good friend Charles Deering, the big industrialist. This painting is it's not a very large painting, and it's painted kind of as a gift, I think, to Deering. It's in Vizcaya, which is down in Miami Beach area. He had this huge manor house that's there, and you can tour it to this day. So when World War I broke out, Sargent was painting in the Austrian Tyrol, and you saw a couple of those earlier paintings that I showed you just a few moments ago. Sargent is profoundly moved and affected by World War I, in part because his niece, Rosemarie's husband, had been killed in action in 1914, shortly after the war gets going. And later, in 1918, just 4 years later, Rosemarie is killed in a church, no less, in Paris in 1918 by a shell from a long-range German gun. So Sargent, along with Augustus John, who, by the way, painted the famous portrait of Lawrence of Arabia, and the other portrait artist, William Orpen, who paints my favorite painting of Winston Churchill during World War I. All 3 of these artists are commissioned by the, what's it called? The British War Memorials Committee to come up with what they want to call a supersized painting depicting the war. So what Sargent does, by the way, Orpen nor Augustus John ever produced the supersized painting, but Sargent goes to the front lines. He does these kind of watercolor studies like you see here. Then he creates this huge painting, 20 feet long, that's called Gassed. And it's not about being on the front lines. Instead, it's about those soldiers blinded by mustard gas. And they are filing, they're like the blind leading the blind. They have their hands each on each other's shoulder as they're being led to a nurse's tent. Here are a couple of details from this enormous painting. I think symbolically, Sargent seems to pose the question in Gassed, how can mankind be so blinded by waging war again and again against one's fellow man? Do they not see the insanity of war? Well, of course not. It's because who are the guys that send these young soldiers off to fight the wars? It's always these power brokers and politicians, etc. So it keeps on going. And it's the blind leading the blind all over again. There are some of the sketches leading up to the painting. Following the supersized painting Gassed, Sargent also received the largest portrait commission of his life, the Generals, which is you see here, which measures over 17 feet in length And it essentially has all the famous World War I generals, including Douglas Haig. He's the commander-in-chief of all those British forces, and he's the one that's sort of slightly off to the right, standing next to the chap with the long coat. Haig, let me just go here. There's a portrait, because what Sargent would do is he used models for all of those generals for his painting, for the composition, but he would paint from life generals. And here are a couple of the studies. And on the left, there's Field Marshal Haig, painted in 1920. Just by circumstances, because, you know, I lived in England and I had that gallery in Edinburgh, Dwight Haig, who was the son of Field Marshal Haig, and he himself had been captured in World War II in Africa, and he was thrown into Colditz Castle, where he spent the rest of the war. Well, he lived through the war, thank God, and I became friends with him to some degree. And when I was visiting Edinburgh, he would invite us to his home called Beamerside, which is the family castle. It's not a huge castle, but it's a nice little castle. And so when I was there, I was sitting in a chair and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, gosh, this is where the King of England has sat, or this is where Winston Churchill has sat, because all the movers and shakers would have come to that castle during the war because Commander Field Marshal Haig was there. He's the guy that's responsible for sending thousands and thousands of men to their death, unfortunately. And finally, I'm about to end. You see a couple of pictures taken of Sargent's studio on Tite Street. Tite Street's in Chelsea, part of London. Tite Street is also where Oscar Wilde lived. It's also, in fact, this studio, he had 31 and 33 Tite Street. Sargent bought that from Whistler. And the color picture you see on the right is my friend Julian Barrow. Julian Barrow I met in the 1980s. He had been living in Sargent's studio and painting there since the 1960s. I took this picture in July of 2013. 2 months later, Julian Barrow died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. And it was so sad, because when I saw him, he was getting ready to go off to Paris. He's the kind of guy who go all over the world, India, Angkor Wat. He painted all over the world, these paintings. That's what he was known for. And also portraits occasionally. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience for bearing with me. And if you have questions, I'll take them.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening lecture. I do have something in the chat room now. We may have to backtrack a bit. I have Christine Daddario, who said,
Okay.
What is that place called? But she didn't tell me what it was actually referring to. So if she's there, could you please ask that question again? Then we had Betsy Levitas. Thanks for the shout out. We will go see those paintings when you come next. So I think that was...
Oh yeah, they're my friends that live in Asheville. That's Betsy and
Okay.
Steve Levitas. They live very close to the Biltmore House.
Okay. Then Melissa Murphy, thank you. Joe McGill, again, that was terrific, Neil. We do have one question in the Q&A. Richard Brenner, in the Joan of Arc painting, was that a tall building in the background behind the trees?
Well, what's happening in that painting, this is sort of where it's not, I mean, it's not naturalistic in what we would seem to sense. This is sort of a mythical thing. This is sort of her home, or this is where Jeanne d'Arc gets the word from God that she's going to lead the French into battle. So this is where she's communing with God, as it were. And there's an angel visiting her. If you look closely at that, I wonder if, well, you can look it up, you can look it up online. Just go to the Metropolitan Museum and see it in real life, or just Google Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc, as the French say, and by Sargent, and by Lepage, and you'll see that painting, and you can study it more closely. And
Richard Brenner says, thank you for a very informative lecture. I thought it was excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Did you say Joseph McGurl had said something as well?
Said thank you very much. That was
all right.
Yes.
He, by the way, he's a friend of mine. He's a very, very, very good artist. And He and I show sometimes at the Salmagundi Club. By the way, that's where there's a reception going on even as I speak tonight. And so I shout out to all my friends who are at the exhibition at the Salmagundi Club for the 145th annual juried competition called the Black and White Show. It's been going on for 145 years, and John Singer Sargent was actually in that exhibition. So was William Merritt Chase. Thomas Moran was the president of the club in the 1890s. Norman Rockwell is a member of the club, all sorts of famous people. Anyway, if you ever get to New York, I'd be happy to take you down there and show you this club, because I'm a member and I used to be the vice president of the club before COVID.
Thank you. Also, okay, a couple more questions. Michelle Murphy says, who do you most admire as a human being for the three artists as a painter, and who influenced your art the most? Who was the happiest?
Well, from what I understand, I mean, I think Sargent and Saroya embraced life in a similar kind of vein. From what I've read, they were quite happy. I mean, Sargent, he never married, but he was very close to his family, and he had all sorts of friends. Well, all three of these artists did, and they all three had friends in high society. But you see, Sargent, he grew up and came from a certain, shall we say, not a silver spoon in his mouth necessarily, but he came from money. His parents were well off. Whereas Saroya and Zorn, they made it on sheer talent, and lots of hard work. Not that Sargent didn't. I think I think all three of these artists were compulsive. They painted all the time. They were very, very prolific. I wish I could be as prolific as these guys were. But to answer Michelle's, I'm influenced by all of them. I love all three of these artists. I guess I know more about Sargent because I came to read Richard Orman's book when I was 18 years old, and thankfully for his book and then subsequently books that came out afterwards as these ateliers, just like the Atelier at Flowerfield. And William Merritt Chase, he started the first plein air painting school about 1.5 miles from where I live, right here in Southampton, largely because his students in New York City, these wealthy students that had houses out here in the Hamptons, they invited William Merritt Chase to come out here and start an atelier. And so he would do that in the summer months. Well, those ateliers didn't exist when I was a student. One would have to go abroad and study in Florence or somewhere, the old masters. In fact, I have presented this lecture at the Florence Academy of Art, and Daniel Graves, another great painter who started the Florence Academy of Art, he's an American who just up and left. He's a little older than I is. He's probably in his, I don't know, mid 70s. I'm 70. Anyway, he went to Europe to study in Florence because he didn't feel he was getting what these guys all learned at these academies. And so that has been greatly revived in literally the last 25, 30 years, 35 years or so.
Okay, another question. Jerome Lewine, those paintings that are outdoors and lovely, how fast can they paint them? How much time? Is it repeated sessions or just a lot of quick studies and then a great work in the studio?
Well, as I mentioned, if you think back to, say, the Oyster Gatherers, that painting on the beach with those groupings of ladies and a couple of little boys, and all the clouds in the background, Sargent didn't just go out and paint that in one afternoon. Especially the bigger version's about 40 inches or 43 or something like that, 48, I can't remember exactly. That painting would have been done a lot of little studies, initially perhaps in charcoal. In fact, I have seen a couple of charcoal studies, and then little oil studies of not all of those individuals, but 2 or 3 of them, like the mother and a child, say, and then another grouping. Then he would put those together and make the painting that you see. called Oyster Gatherers. Now, in say that little study, I'm almost tempted to go back because it's not very far back. Well, let's see if I can do this while I'm talking. Let me just flip back through these very quickly. Well, these were done on location right then and there. Sargent would do these on location. They're not very big. They're like 15 by 20 inches. Where's my mouse? Here we go. Those are big. Those are done from studies. Well, that painting right there, whoops. That painting would have been done in one fell swoop. That was probably done in an afternoon in a couple of hours. It's only 19 by 23 inches. So you see, it depends on what it is. That little painting, like if I keep going backwards, those little paintings might have been done in 37 by 25 inches. That was probably done in one sitting or perhaps two. This one's fairly large, 48 by 40. I think it was probably painted on several days. This might have been done in one afternoon, and then Sargent might have reworked it and you know, but he would have, in other words, he would have gotten the composition laid out. He would have gotten it going, whether he completely finished it in that place or back at his hotel room. You know, these guys were so gifted, they could just sort of finish things on their own because they were so used to looking and staring at something very intently. But I want to go back there. This little paint. Whoops. Where is that? That little painting. That's only 9 by 12 inches. Saroya would have knocked that off in probably an hour, maybe not even that long. Those guys were really, really talented. So that I hope that asks his or answers his question.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of comments. Barbara Stein just says, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Jim Thompson says, Neill, great presentation. Which museum would have the best collection of these three artists?
Well, I'm a little prejudiced in a sense, but I think it's also true. New York City, despite, you know, in the age of the internet, they like to say that, I mean, in the 19th century, Paris was the art capital of the Western world. Everybody that wanted to be somebody would go and study in Paris, which is why Sargent did, and anyway, a lot of other Americans, but including Homer, including Hopper, rather. Hopper went over there and studied too in Paris. Anyway, I still think that the art capital of the Western world is the Metropolitan Museum, or just New York City, because the Hispanic Society is there. And in that one place, you can see enormous, and I mean huge paintings, 45 feet long and by 12 feet tall, of Saroya. And then if you go to the Met, you can see a great painting, that great painting of Mrs. Walter Rathbone Bacon by Zorn. And you can see in one room about 6 or 8 Sargents. And if you go in another room, there are all these little small paintings that he did on his holidays. So you can see a lot just in New York City. Now, if you go to Washington, D.C., the National Gallery also has a lot of Sargents. In fact, that painting called In the Loggia, that painting is in the Freer Museum in Washington, D.C. But the National Gallery and the National, what do they call it? The American Museum, or the Museum of American Art, which isn't on Museum Mile, but is up in the city of DC, which also is where the National Portrait Gallery is housed. Both of those museums in one building, they have some great examples of Sargent and other great American painters.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a message from Paula Tuckerman. We are studying Sargent's edges and looked at the beggar girl's hand and edge of sleeve. This is similar to the cutoff of the sleeve mentioned in the portrait of Carolus Duran.
Yeah. Well, I think, see, again, I feel, you know, I have to confess, I'm used to presenting my lectures live in front of an audience. I mean, the last time I did this, there were like 150 people or more sitting out in the Salmagundi Club. And the images I showed this evening were projected live on, large on a screen. I just simply don't know what they are able to see. Each computer's arranged a little differently. I mean, if you go full screen, maybe you can enlarge some of the images, but I guess I don't know how to answer a question except to say that
I think it's really more.
Well, that's one reason that I presented these images sometimes with details, because hopefully in the detail you would be able to ascertain that sort of handwriting of the artist, as it were.
And I'm going to answer John Landis' question. Yes, this lecture will be available to view later. It will be up on our website. That's atelier@flowerfield.org. Should hopefully be up by Friday, so you can certainly see it again. Jerome DeWine just said, well, the prolific painting relates to how much time a painting takes. So comment. And he also says it seems too that an ability they might have had is like a photographic memory of the visual scene to perfect it later in a studio. Yeah,
the thing is, I mean, people use that term pretty loosely, photographic memory. They might have done that, but they didn't paint like photographs. They always seem to transition. First and foremost, which is why I would like you to see these paintings in real life and why I like paintings like this. I'm not actually very taken with hyper-realistic photographic paintings. I find, if you want a photograph, take a photograph. I like a painting to look like a painting. I want to me, the magic of painting, in fact, the painting behind me, if you could see that up close, it's very thickly painted. It's all about the intrinsic quality of paint on canvas. And if I were to turn this around, I don't know what you can see here, but this is let's see, I have to stand in a certain way. That's a painting of mine, which started from a charcoal drawing of, I can't seem to hold it still, of the 59th Street Bridge from Roosevelt Island looking into Manhattan. That painting's 60 inches across. So from a distance, you stand across the room, it looks very naturalistic. But when you go up close, it's all about the intrinsic quality of paint on a canvas. That's what it's all about. So to answer Jerry's question, they may have had photographic memories, but they were great at inventing things that looked plausible. That's all you have to do. You have to say a truth in painting of this type that's not purely abstract. Often they're finding the abstraction within reality. I mean, look at that little the handling of that water there in the foreground. It's just really a bunch of abstract shapes, but it reads as cast shadow and dancing water, the gondolas, etc. Or this painting. That's a great little, it's also knowing what to put in and what to leave out. It's just like being a writer. These artists were so good that they would know how to edit their work. He doesn't have all the picky detail that would be in a photographic kind of painting. What he does is he creates the illusion of suggested detail, and he gives you just enough to just kind of make your mind's eye fills in the rest. Found it both interesting and informative. Also, we would like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management for their generous sponsorship of tonight's program. Our next event will be on February 24th, and it's a painting demonstration by instructor Elizabeth Fusco titled Spring Tulips. Please look out for our email about this demo and other upcoming events and classes. And as I said earlier, this video has been recorded and will be available to view again on our website, atelier@flowerfield.org. Thank you very much again, Neill, and good night. Well, I want to just thank you and the Atelier. I mean, you and Brianna and Joan Rockwell and the whole staff of the Atelier. You couldn't have been nicer to me and helped me, put this whole Zorn, Saroya, or the Triumphant Triad together for this evening. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again. It was very good. Thank you very much.
All right. Good night.